Before listening to this sermon, if you could please read John chapter 20. There's a link below this video. When was the last time you ran? At least your version of running. For many, our last and only experience of running was running for the bus. When we see a bus leaving, something inside of us makes us want to pump our arms and force our legs into action. We're desperate, truly desperate, not to be stuck at the bus stop, waiting for the next bus, which is due in 15 minutes. That is, 15 minutes according to the bus timetable, which roughly translates as an hour and a half, or a quarter past never turned up o'clock. When we don't want to be stuck in the same place forever, we run. Which may be why 3 times we hear that Jesus' followers all ran. Verse 2, Mary Magdalene came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple. Verse 4, so Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Peter and his friend were really pushing themselves to reach that tomb as soon as possible. Why? I wonder if it was because, like us, they did not want to be stuck in the same place forever. Peter and the disciples had been sat the entire previous day, thinking about the painful disappointment they'd experienced the day before. We read in Luke 24 that one of them reports that the chief priests and our rulers handed him, Jesus of Nazareth, over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Jesus had been crucified on Friday. The disciples had spent their entire Saturday in painful reflection. They'd hoped that Jesus was going to rescue them from the very worst things in their lives. But they'd seen their Messiah, their Saviour, crucified and killed. And now they were stuck facing the reality that things were never going to change. Oppressors like the Romans would always remain in power. Their difficulties in life would always continue. Life for all will always end in death. For a moment, consider the thoughts and emotions of that long Easter Saturday. Think of the worst in your life at the moment, the most painful of realities. How would it feel to hear these words? You're stuck here forever. Things are never going to change. Being stuck in this dark emotional hole is so much worse than spending 15 minutes stuck at a bus stop. Pain, sadness, despair, suffering. You're stuck with them forever. Things are never going to change. Every person, religious or not, fears these words being true. For this reason, every person is running towards some Messiah, someone or something that they believe offer them the hope of change. People are running towards anything and everything to fill the vast emptiness inside of them. People are running towards the treatments, the solutions that they believe can answer their greatest need. People are running towards anything that promises some escape from the painful realities of this world. No one wants to be stuck in a situation of pain, sadness, and despair. That's why we were desperate for an end to the pandemic. For many, the vaccine was the Messiah. That's why every hour you wait to see a doctor is an hour too long. That's why antidepressants are the most prescribed pill on the NHS. These are our medical messiahs that we hope can in some way uplift us and bring us out of our depressing and sad lives. We struggle to watch as millions suffer in the Middle East and Ukraine, and we run towards entertainment and pleasure as a distraction. We desperately don't want to hear these words. You're stuck here forever. These things are never going to change. That's why we run towards any Messiah, any Saviour, any solution that might offer us hope and change. And so Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple. So Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. The stone covering the tomb of Jesus was rolled away. This was God's invitation to the disciples and to us to look inside. Look inside the tomb and think over the implications. If Jesus' body lay dead in that tomb, the disciples' hopes had ended in bitter disappointment. Jesus was not the Messiah that they had hoped for. But if Jesus' body was not in that tomb, if Jesus had risen from death, then that means Jesus is greater than death. Jesus' promises can be trusted. Jesus is the Messiah we so desperately want and need. For this reason, chapter 20 not only encourages us to hope, it encourages us to think. Verse 1, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw the stone that had been removed from the entrance. Verse 5, the other disciple bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Notice the increasing levels of investigation and the increasing level of evidence found. Mary sees the stone rolled away. The other disciple sees the stone rolled away and also looks inside. Simon Peter sees the stone rolled away. He looks inside. He goes inside. Each disciple stops, investigates, and examines the evidence. And each discovers evidence upon evidence that all say the same thing. The angel said to the woman, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay." We're told to think upon the evidence, not simply hope. For when you hope without thinking, a great deal of damage can be done. For example, 1.5 million youngsters play football 4 nights a week at football academies, hoping to become a Premiership footballer. Only 0.012% will ever play a single minute in the Premier League. They're taught to hope, not to think, and so many lives are shattered. Millions enter the lottery every week, hoping it could be them. They hope it could be me, more than they think about the odds that it won't. Probably the saddest thing I see as a nurse is people being told that they've got terminal, incurable cancer for which there is no treatment. The next question to the doctor very often is, when am I getting my operation? When do I start my treatment? Sometimes it's easier to hope without thinking. But when we hope and don't think, the result is we end up disappointed. We put our hope in the idea of hope itself, or we place our hopes in some Messiah that has let so many other people down before. But in contrast, the Bible only encourages the hope that is based on thinking. Is there credible evidence that the hopes of Christianity are true? Is Jesus the Messiah in whose promises I can trust? Verse 6. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. Mary discovers some evidence that Jesus may have risen. The other disciple discovers more evidence to back up that claim. Then Peter discovers even more evidence on top of that. In having these scenes recorded, John is encouraging you and I to join these disciples. Look in the empty tomb, investigate the evidence, hope and think. If you are not a believer, don't throw the idea of Jesus being the Messiah in the bin without thinking. Think over the historical evidence for his existence. Think over whether what he taught rings true. Think over the evidence for his resurrection. Think over the hundreds of Old Testament prophecies where things about Jesus' life and death were predicted hundreds of years before. Don't dismiss Jesus without thinking. And don't believe in Jesus without thinking either. So often I, as a believer, wonder to myself, do I just believe these things because that's all I've ever known? Do people believe in Jesus' promises simply because they sound nice? Are you and I simply getting carried away by the lyrics of catchy hymns? If you consider yourself a believer, is there solid, credible evidence to the things that you currently believe? John reassures us that there is. Verse 30. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Crime scene investigators rely on tiny bits of evidence to arrive at the truth. A strand of hair, a spot of blood, a single sperm. All of these are crucial at arriving at the truth. That's why forensic material is kept for 30 years after the crime. For if CSI throws out even a tiny bit of evidence, they may not be able to prove who did the crime. A tiny bit of evidence gets thrown out and the whole case falls apart. Contrast this to the evidence John presents us with. Verse 30, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. John left half the evidence out of his book. John was so confident that there was more than enough evidence about Jesus that he could afford to chuck half out the window. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. More than half of the people in chapter 20 were doubters. Yet even they were convinced of the evidence for the resurrection, despite their doubts. Half the people who saw the resurrected Jesus were women. Women's testimony at that time wouldn't be accepted in a court of law. But John knew that so many people saw the risen Jesus that even if half were ignored, people couldn't doubt it. For the first half of Peter's life, Peter was fearful and unwilling to die for what he only half understood. And yet Peter saw the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, and he was so confident that he was willing to die for what he'd seen. Half the material in Matthew, Mark and Luke are left out of John's Gospel. John knows that the things he records will be enough to convince anyone with an open mind. Do this for your other messiahs. Throw out half and see what you're left with. If the NHS had half its budget and threw half its pills out the window, would you be as confident when you went into hospital? Or if you threw out half, would the whole thing not fall apart? Could a millionaire throw out half their 10 billion fortune with a relaxed smile on their face? Or would they still be worried that even their 5 million left might not be enough. Throw the half out of the history books that records our worst mistakes as humans, or the times we humans got it wrong. Would the half left be enough evidence to convince you that humans are wise, good people who have all the answers? There is so little evidence that these messiahs have all the answers, and so much evidence that they'll let us down. And yet, John throws half the evidence that Jesus was who he claimed out the window. And John still has enough evidence to convince us if we'll let him. Even when people who sit half on the fence are presented with half of the evidence about Jesus and do half an amount of investigation, even they discover more evidence and truth than they bargained for. And the truth about Jesus is a wonderful thing. Because of Jesus' resurrection, you and I can have hope. Because Jesus has risen from death, Jesus is greater than the worst problem you and I will ever face. Because Jesus has risen, Jesus' words can be trusted, even when they seem humanly impossible. Because Jesus has risen from death, Jesus is the Messiah we so desperately want and need.